So I got a question from Drew, and Drew says, I've been thinking about your shoulder flexion video and your comments about how it's common for individuals to use internal rotation to finish shoulder flexion. To improve shoulder flexion without this compensation, what are your thoughts on Landmine or Viking pressing? And so he brings up a couple of variations also on that theme of using a Viking or a Landmine press. And Drew, what I would say is the thing that we want to be sure of is that we have an understanding of why we actually have this limitation in shoulder flexion in the first place, and that's going to help us determine what strategies we're going to use to help restore it. So let me turn Alfred around so we can actually see what the limitation is on this overhead reach. So when we get a compressive strategy on the posterior aspect of the thorax, the higher up the posterior compression, the greater the limitation in overhead reach. So many people will actually be limited below the level of the scapula, and they're not going to be able to perform any form of pressing without a compensatory strategy above shoulder level. As we get up into the upper thorax, this is where we're really looking at the overhead reach limitations. So if we were to use, say, a Viking press or a Landmine press in an attempt to restore the ability to reach overhead without a compensatory strategy that would represent a full external rotation of the shoulder overhead, one of the limitations of this exercise is the amount of load that we're going to use. If I was to use an excessive load that would require me to perform an exhalation strategy to complete the press, I'm defeating my purpose of trying to get my arm overhead without compensation. An increased load demands that I use an exhalation strategy to complete the activity. That's going to cause compression in the upper thorax and immediately limit my capacity to externally rotate the shoulder with my arm in an overhead position. That doesn't mean that I can't use these activities to enhance my ability to shift airflow from side to side. If I perform these activities in a unilateral manner, with the appropriate loads, I can actually improve my capacity to reach overhead. So Drew, let's head out into the gym and we'll go over a couple of nuances using the Landmine press to show you what I mean. So Drew, here's an example of how we would use Landmine pressing to help maintain or gain left shoulder flexion. So I'm set up in left half kneeling here, and what I'm going to do is create a propulsive strategy on the right side by pushing the right hip ahead of the left. In doing so, I create a posterior compressive strategy on the right, which will allow my left posterior to expand. It's the expansion in the dorsal rostral area that allows me to maintain or recapture overhead reach on the left side. As I press upward, I'm going to maintain my posterior expansion by reaching forward but not allowing my thorax to drift forward. If I was to reach forward and turn into the press, I would create a posterior compressive strategy on the left side, which would defeat the purpose of creating the expansion for overhead reach. Since my goal is to emphasize left shoulder flexion, as I'm pressing with the right arm, I can create a posterior compressive strategy on the right that will also help me maintain my expansion on the left. So what I'm going to do here on my setup is shift my left hip posteriorly, which again turns my pelvis to the left. This helps me emphasize the posterior expansion as I press on the right side. As I press on the right, I'm going to create the posterior compression, the propulsive strategy on the right side, which will help me maintain left side expansion. So Drew, it's not one particular exercise that's so important. What's important is that you respect the goal. If the goal is to maintain or improve shoulder flexion, then any activity of choice has to maintain the posterior expansion in the dorsal rostral thorax. So don't forget to take load into consideration. If my goal is to increase force production, I am always going to superimpose an exhalation strategy, as this is required for high force. Just remember that this higher force production is going to require the exhalation strategy that may compromise your ability to reach overhead